families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Families Divided TV. I'm Elaine Cobb. I'm founder and president of Family Access Fighting for Children's Rights. I'm also your host and executive producer of Families Divided TV. In the United States, the second Sunday in September is always declared Grandparents' Day. For many, that's a very special day. For others, not so much. There are many thousands, yet millions in the world, and here too in the United States, especially now, who are alienated from their grandchildren. Some haven't seen them for years. Some, as in my case, have never met their grandchild or grandchildren. We have never met our granddaughter Dare, and we so long to see her. So Grandparents' Day is an especially hard day. In this segment, Dr. Carol Golly is going to share with you tips on how to get through alienation and the struggles it is for those who are alienated grandparents. She'll be with us in just a moment.
Hello, my name is Carol Golly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I was in private practice for many years, working with children and families in Naples, Florida. And I'm very excited to be here today with Families Divided. I would like to thank them for having me on the program, and also thank you very much to Elaine Cobb. So my talk today is going to be about grandparent alienation, or grandparents who are cut off from their grandchildren, and what that is exactly, and how does it affect grandparents, and what strategies exist that might be of help in addressing this if it's happening to you or someone you know or in your family. And also what might help with coping with the situation, because it's a very difficult thing to cope with for grandparents. So we'll start off by talking briefly about what is grandparent alienation. It's a situation where grandparents are denied contact with their grandchildren. And in general, in the past, they have enjoyed healthy relationships. So this may be a very sudden cutoff situation, or it could be more gradual, but it may include such things as the grandchildren are not able or allowed to receive calls from the grandparents anymore, or mail, or they're not allowed to visit the grandparents. So this can be anywhere from kind of a slight alienation or cutoff to very severe, where some grandparents have unfortunately not been able to see their grandchildren for many years. So it's a very sad situation. There are estimated to be 100 million grandparents across the world in this situation. So it's very serious. And this is not a normal situation, as I said, generally grandparents and grandchildren interact with each other regularly, and traditionally and historically have enjoyed as regular contact as possible, depending on where they live and so forth. And grandparents are very important to grandchildren. And why is that? What do grandparents provide for grandchildren? that is so critical for our society? Well, grandparents provide a variety of emotional and financial supports. They are caregivers, storytellers, playmates, mentors, and friends. And we do know that infants and young children who have regular contact with grandparents turn out to have higher scores on IQ tests. So there's a real connection to success of grandchildren in having a relationship with their grandparents. Also, grandparents can provide a buffer between the adult child and the grandchildren, because often grandchildren will confide in their grandparents, and there will be more communication during times of family stress. So grandparents are an important source of support to the grandchildren and also to the adult child and her family, because they can also model healthy and appropriate ways of parenting that they've learned over the years. Also provide information on the family culture, perhaps their faith communities and beliefs. So there is a great deal that grandparents have to share, and many ways they are helpful to their grandchildren and adult children. So how is grandparent access to grandchildren established? Well, it's through the adult children, because the adult children are the ones that have the legal responsibility and the right to privacy in our Constitution to raise their grandchildren in the way they see fit, which are their children, the adult child able to raise their children. So the access for grandparents is almost always through their adult child, who is considered the gatekeeper. So sometimes there can be, when there is a marriage of their adult child, then sometimes alliances can change because the spouse becomes important, and sometimes extremely important to the point of excluding the grandparents. So there can be quite a few changes once the adult child marries and has a spouse, and there can be loyalty conflicts around, is the adult child more loyal to the spouse? To the exclusion of the grandparents is something that we tend to see. And cutting grandparents out of grandchildren's lives almost always indicates that there's a problem with the marriage, because that is not a normal situation, and it's considered abusive of the grandchildren and elder abuse of the grandparent. So what happens? How did grandparents get in that situation? I know from working with grandparents that they say, I don't know what changed. Just suddenly I was cut off and I didn't know what I did wrong, is a common occurrence in grandparent cutoff, or it can be more gradual. But what are the pathways that could lead to that? How could that happen? It really wasn't something we saw too much years ago, because often 3 generations before the 1940s, 3 generations would often reside in the same home. And there wasn't so much movement and throughout the country of the generations. So one of the pathways could be when an adult child dies. And that's how I first heard about grandparent alienation. Was a woman in England whose son was in the Royal Navy and he had died in service to his country. And her daughter-in-law was mourning so and in so much grief that she just packed up and moved away and cut the grandmother, Margaret, out of the granddaughter's life. And so that seems to be something that can happen as a grandparent can be cut out of their grandchild's life, is death of their adult child. And Also, it could be when an adult child becomes incarcerated, or if there's a family feud. And, it's normal for all families to have their differences and conflicts, but to be cut out in a family feud is along the more extreme end of family conflict, clearly. It also could be due to mental illness or substance abuse in the family, where the adult child is unable to provide care um, for the grandchild, and perhaps the grandchild is placed in foster care, or with another set of grandparents. So that is another pathway to a grandparent being alienated. It can also be as a result of parental alienation, which is something that we're seeing more and more as families divorce, and what we used to call custody battles, um, but really, which is parenting time and sharing of children in divorce. And sometimes one parent can turn the children against the other parent, and when there's no justification for that. And so that's called parental alienation. And unfortunately, if you're an alienated parent who is cut out of your children's life, then it's in extreme cases, it's very difficult to cope with that. It's very difficult to get back into your child's life. And in general, your family and your extended family can be cut out of your children's lives also. So grandparents can become collateral damage in that situation, which is very sad. And more often than not, paternal grandparents seem to be cut out of their grandchildren's lives more often than maternal grandparents are. So there's something about the maternal line of child raising that tends to end up raising the children. Remains the parental responsibility can remain with mothers intergenerationally, and that's starting to change through the court system, but it still can be very difficult for fathers sometimes, and the parents of the fathers to have access to grandchildren sometimes. Most often, the paternal grandparents would be cut off by a controlling daughter-in-law. And so what are the consequences for this, for grandparents? What are the emotional and physical consequences for them? Because this is really a traumatic thing, a traumatic situation for them. And I did my doctoral research on this. I was really surprised that there was so little research on the effect of being cut off from grandchildren, on the well-being of grandparents. And we need that information to help figure out a better way how to keep parents connected, because they are so vitally important to grandchildren. So I looked at this and found out that grandparents that are cut off from grandchildren generally have a higher risk for depression, for what we call ambiguous and complicated grief, trauma and post-traumatic stress issues, which is really refers to nightmares and difficulty sleeping because of that, and having flashbacks of losing your grandchildren, or perhaps the time you spent with them that you're no longer allowed to. So there's a trauma aspect to this type of grief that makes it profoundly more difficult to cope with. Also, grandparents can have suicidal thinking, suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And the suicidal thinking and complicated grief and depression are not the norm for seniors. Probably in about 1% to 3% of the senior population, we might see this, but not to the extent that I saw in my study, which said that 46% of alienated or cut off grandparents suffer from depression, and 13% from complicated grief. So that's a very high percentage of, of, of emotional difficulties and challenges for grandparents in this situation. Physical consequences for grandparents are the stress-related consequences that we tend to see under stress, which include blood pressure and heart problems, gastrointestinal issues, sleep disorders, which can lead to lots of other kinds of disorders also. So there is a woman who first identified the term ambiguous loss. Her name is Dr. Pauline Boss, and she was at the University of Minnesota. And she really identified that the type of loss called ambiguous loss makes it very difficult to cope with and to reconcile, because your grandchildren are still alive and they are present. But if you're not allowed to have a connection with them or a relationship with them, then there's a severe grieving to that for most grandparents. There's a continued hope for reunification, which results in ongoing stress. And grandparents say that they look everywhere for their grandchildren. Every time they go out in a crowd, they're looking. Sometimes they don't know what their grandchildren would look like as they've gotten older, but they're always searching and looking. And that's a very unusual kind of stress that comes from an unusual kind of grieving. It's not the norm when somebody dies and we bury them and have cultural rituals and faith community rituals to help us cope with that loss. So Pauline Boss said, what you're experiencing is ambiguous loss because your loved ones are still missing. It is the most difficult, most stressful kind of loss there is, but it is not your fault. And Dr. Boss started her work by studying missing workers who disappeared in the World Trade Center in 9/11 of 2001. And the people grieving their loved ones in that situation were often met with people saying, why can't they just move on and get over it? It's been 3 years, it's been 5 years, it's been 10 years. Why can't they move on? But as she identified, it's very difficult to do that. And there's also a lot of guilt associated with it, because a lot of families who lost loved ones in 9/11 said, well, it was my fault because I set the alarm off too early, and my wife went to work so early that day that she was there when the buildings collapsed. So that's the kind of guilt that we can see with people with ambiguous loss. And it seems to really apply to grandparents also, because you have that connection of the heart with your adult child and your grandchild, and you know that they're out there, but you just don't have access to them. So grandparents are likely a group that may suffer in silence because they may have fear of talking about their feelings to other people, because they're afraid that if their adult child finds out that they've been telling other people, I'm not allowed to see my grandchildren, then they could become angrier and make it even more difficult to reunify. So often grandparents say they suffer in silence and have a type of disenfranchised grief, particularly in Florida, where I'm from, but I know in any state, but Florida is considered the grandparent state, and everybody talks about the grandchildren there. So that's a very difficult situation for grandparents, particularly with our upcoming Grandparents' Day in September, and just other times that you may want to talk about it, but feel that it's risky to do that. So what are what are the options for grandparents in this situation? What can they do to try to effect a reunification? And what can they do for coping? So, first of all, there are quite a few cases of reunifications that we know of. And so I know about 350 known to reported to some grandparent groups that I'm associated with. And so we have looked at, not really with research yet, we'd like to do that, but anecdotally, what has worked for those grandparents. It's really important to know that, to share with other grandparents who are in that situation. So what has worked is focusing on your adult child. And that can be very difficult because there can be a lot of hurt and anger there. But to become businesslike in the approach and decide, okay, I'm going to reach out once a month with a friendly email and check in with my adult child and let them know you're available, that you love them, and that you are hoping that this can be reconciled someday. And so an email is a good way, a text, a letter, and there are some don'ts about this, because you don't want to tell them how sad you are and how difficult it's been in your life, although that's probably very accurate, and you'd like to say that, and you have every right to be angry about it. But the problem is it won't be helpful, from what we know about reunification. So if you can instead just decide to be, supportive and cheerful about them, and reach out with a text message and say, hi, I'm thinking of you today. Maybe share a photo of a flower or a dog you saw and say, oh, this reminded me of, this puppy that I knew you loved, or a type of flower that reminded me of you, or something brief that can stir a little bit of a happy memory. And then just say, oh, I'm looking forward to getting together sometime. I hope you have a great week. And keep it brief and upbeat like that, in that manner. You also want to cycle through themes of I love you, I miss you, I'm thinking of you, and I'm really hoping that we can meet someday. And you could put more specific a more specific invitation included in an email once in a while, or a text like, what do you think about going for a walk for a half hour next week? Or could we meet for coffee? That would be fun. And not dig into the past, because a lot of the adult children have reported feeling very guilty about the situation. They know they're withholding their grandchildren who could be benefiting from wonderful relationships with their grandparent, and they feel guilty about that. So they just can't handle going into that guilt. So the only way they can handle reunification is if we don't make them go there. Maybe in the future, sometime there'll be an opportunity to talk about it, but in the reunification process, it's a really bad time to do that. Another idea is to recognize your grandchildren's and your adult children's birthdays and special occasions. Even if you're not invited to the house, if you can, send gifts. We have situations where the grandchild later said, I knew you sent gifts all the time, Grandma and Grandpa. My mom wouldn't ever let me see them, but I saw the mailman bring it to the house, and I knew that you were thinking of me. And same with letters. You just never know what can happen. And the most important thing about this approach is you have to do what you think might work. And it might just work this time. So don't give up on trying. Remember, your grandchildren want you in their lives. You can make a memory box if you're not allowed to have any contact with your grandchildren. Some people have made memory boxes where they put cards and letters, and They may have put books in about, there's a wonderful book that Dr. John Killinger wrote called From Poppy with Love, Letters to the Grandchildren I Was Not Allowed to See. And it's very lovely and gentle and kind. And he talks to his grandchildren and talks about what they might be doing today. And some parents have included that in a memory book box. But you could include photos of family from generations, because they need that information, and they can really enjoy that. We had one reunification from a grandfather that did this for years, and his grandson came at about age 18 or 19 to his house one day out of the blue and said, "Grandpa, I don't know why you never wrote to me. I always wanted you to." And he said, "Hold on a second." And he went to the back room and brought the memory box out. And the grandson sat there for hours reading through these things. And he said, I understand. And it was a treasure for him. And so they were, how important that is to both of them. So you can also write an amends letter to your adult child and keep it very general. Like, I'm so sorry, whatever I did to hurt you. I know I wasn't a perfect parent. None of us are, right? Every family, every parent, we all have issues. We do the best we can with what we have. But an amends letter would be, I love you, and I'm sorry for, anything that I did. And I would love a chance to, just to be with you someday or talk about it more. But amends letters can be very tricky because you don't want to say too much. So there are some guidelines about that on the Family Access website from several of the experts in the field of parental alienation. I know I just have another quick minute. The most important thing is coping. Cultivate emotional resilience for yourself. Exercise, breathe, reach out to others, and step back and give value to the relationships you do have with your friendships, your faith community, maybe volunteer work. You're really important and you have so much to offer.
Join us next week on Families Divided when Dr. Colleen Murray interviews Bill Eddy about his book, Don't Alienate the Kids. Miss an episode of Families Divided? Don't forget that you can find all previous episodes plus additional content on the Families Divided TV YouTube channel.